The world we want and need already exists, but in pieces. Collective Now is a project to connect those pieces and create something much greater than the sum of its parts. I'm Susanna Shapiro, and welcome to the Collective Now podcast. In today's episode, we're exploring restorative justice. How are our communities healing harm, rebuilding trust, and imagining something beyond police, courts, and putting people in cages? To help us think through these questions, I'm joined by two remarkable practitioners. Elissa Barrett is the Executive Director of the Western Justice Center in Los Angeles. This organization is working to transform how schools and communities respond to conflict. WJC has become a leader in restorative practices rooted in equity, justice, and healing. Lul Muhamud is the Executive Director of the Person Center, a DC-based nonprofit supporting survivors of domestic violence in the African immigrant and refugee community. Her approach to care is grounded in trusting and centering the power of those she serves. I'm so glad both of you are here. Now let's get into it. What have you guys seen in terms of alternatives?
Elissa, you want to share a little more about what you've been seeing?
I'm based in Los Angeles. And so here there's been a movement building for many years around care first, jails last, but in a very structured way, bringing together community-based organizations and philanthropy and government to reimagine how we are navigating public safety. And how do we do public safety in a way that is not at the expense of communities of color and communities at the lower end of the economic ladder? I think there's a range of views. I think there are some people that believe in no incarceration ever, not for any reason. And then there's some people that say maybe there is some space away from community, but it looks very different than incarceration. It looks like trauma-informed therapy and care and a process to express accountability around whatever the action has happened. And I understand there's a lot of resistance to that concept because as a country, we are very invested in punishment. And so our work at the Western Justice Center is for bringing that conversation into the K through 12 educational system and saying, the data tells us removing young people from the educational environment and punishing them as a way to respond to their behavior is not effective. And our work is, let's not wait until young people are in juvenile hall, are in sort of the most intense level of trauma that they're experiencing. And the data shows that even a few weeks in a juvenile facility has a lasting damage on a young person's life. So if we know how much harm this all does, like, why are we waiting to the highest trauma point to do intervention? Why are we not reimagining the whole system from the front end?
First of all, the work that you do is so phenomenal. I feel like at the core of it, it's protective work. It's where you're trying to protect not just the potential, but to protect the most sacred asset that we have in our communities and in humanity, which is the individual. In my line of work, the Person Center, we respond to domestic and sexual violence and family violence in the context of African immigrant and refugee communities. And we're based here in DC. We serve folks in the DC area. But a lot of the work that we do is not just in the violence response. We're constantly required to question and challenge the systems and structures that we've gotten so accustomed to when it comes to responding to domestic and sexual violence.
California spends $18 billion a year restraining people.
Wow.
Imagine if even a fraction of that money, the California Community Schools Partnership Program, over a 7-year period of time, was $4 billion. And that's designed to create a whole community holistic approach where we're not just supporting kids in school, but we're thinking about the whole kid, the whole family, the whole community. And it's been game changing for communities that have the community schools grants. Imagine if we were putting just a small sliver of the money that we're spending on incarceration into these systems that involve choice, agency, empowerment, a cultural sensitivity. And I think there's an important piece here of helping people understand that absence of a punishment as consequence is replaced in these structures with mutual accountability, which I think is more difficult to come to.
I like how both of you are talking about on the small level transformation. So like individually kind of empowering, providing agency, not being coercive, but being really motivating and inspiring hope and attempts, but also on a more meso and macro about, yeah, the whole approach is transformative.
I'm Somali American. My parents both immigrated here from Somalia. So I was raised in two cultures. I know the American culture and I know their culture. And what never clicked was this idea of your child turns 18, kick them out the house. It does something to you, you don't like it, you cut off relationships with them.
Yeah.
That's a foreign concept to a lot of people because humans are indisposable in our communities.
I do want to highlight a couple things. Yeah, of blaming the victim and having to choose loyalty versus it's almost like the community then has to sabotage itself. It's not helping anyone. It's not learning anything new because it's just trying to protect itself from already oppressive systems, which relates to what Elissa was saying. If the whole process is different, if that person isn't punished in the same way, or if there's a chance for not stigmatizing them, not immediately writing them off, and this whole confirmation bias where you like, oh, they're a criminal. Now I see everything they do as criminal and they're a bad person. It's like, it's all these things get rooted out. There's a different approach, like a fundamentally different approach, which is what I want to hear more from Elissa,
People do harmful things. I think it's important to say we are not pretending that people don't do harmful things. And we are not saying there shouldn't be a consequence to that. What we are talking about is a consequence that can be constructive versus a consequence that is further destruction. So a consequence that is destructive is this idea of removing people from community, that they are disposable as human beings. The way that the system is structured in some parts, and I want to talk about the parts that are not structured like that anymore, because I think that's important to talk about, that our response is you have done something harmful. It broke this rule. The consequence of that is this punishment. And then in our eyes, we have done what we needed to do and we're done, right? Versus a process of mediation or restorative practice or restorative justice or diversion, which is you have done something harmful. We would like to all look at and learn from this harm. And so we're going to be in community together to look at what has happened. And we're going to invite you to evolve. And we're also going to be willing to listen and evolve. So we're talking about there is a response to the harm. One response, the punishment response, is this, which is destructive in the way that you just articulated, versus a restorative response or a mediation-driven response, which is we are going to sit with the discomfort of what has happened. And our goal is to evolve and transform individually and communally in response to this. So it's not like you did this horrible thing, we're going to sit in a circle and then we did our thing and you go off on your way. It's no, there has to be accountability for the action. And I think it's very important for us to name that these are not new practices. These are practices that go back to indigenous community in many places in the world. And we are returning to that wisdom. We're returning to that wisdom, whether it's the Maori people or the Algonquin community or this idea. For example, in traditional Hawaiian society, there's a practice of ho'oponopono. And when there is a harm or a rift or a disagreement in the community, all of the people that are connected to the two people who are in conflict come together. And each person says, here's what I have contributed to this conflict. I did not intervene. I did not speak up. I did not let the people know how their actions were affecting me and people that I care about. And when we hear about how our actions are affecting this wide group of people, that gives us an opportunity to think about ourselves differently and make a change. This is just a way for people to avoid the consequences of their actions. We hear that all the time in education. I want to do this. Kids need to understand there's a consequence for those actions. This is just some woo-woo kumbaya bullshit that is not going to teach kids anything, right? And the thing is, it takes time. And so that's a systemic question that we're just starting to ask is, what would it look like to change some of the burdens and responsibilities that are on educators so they could actually have space in the school day to, this is part of the learning process. We're not just memorizing facts and math equations and other things. We're learning how to be humans. And Lul, you said something so important. There was like American culture and Somali culture, right? And so one of the things that we have not been practicing in American culture is interconnectedness. And these are things, if we learn this in our education, we see we are interconnected with other human beings. We can't throw people away. We're responsible for each other. It's like a whole different way of practicing small d democracy. So
Yeah, I think around the world, people do this much more. Like our first podcast, we interviewed Ashish Kodhari, and he's doing this like decentralized approach across the different states in India, and he's looking at different examples. And there's so much of this. But since we had a functioning government for so long, people aren't always thinking that way. And the government had always been it's much more we're capital focused. Where, like you said, this idea isn't just people, it's things. We throw things out. We're not as relational as most places.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention that one of the major things that is blocking us from that interconnectedness is that interconnectedness is a threat to the American system, to the country in and of itself. We know that in the US, we may have one book that establishes how the laws of the land are applied to the citizens of it, but we know that in reality, it's not applied the same to each subgroup within our American citizenship. And I believe the United States is, and where we are in America, it's so hard to practice collectivism because our collectivism has a disclaimer with it. Our interconnectedness is limited to the pools to which we are segregated. And I tell folks all the time, I really do not believe we will be able to effectively respond to the violence crisis in our communities until, number one, we discuss the violence crisis caused by the systems we live within and their structures. But that will only be addressed if we are able to face the difficult and uncomfortable conversation on the fact that we fail to and struggle to see the same humanity and rights amongst folks from different backgrounds, different racial background. It's a really ugly and it's really true. And I think no matter how much progress we make talking about it, genuinely, the only way this change happens is if we do recognize the humanity of everyone here. And I think we're extremely far from the practice of it. I think we're very, very far from the practice of it. And I say that because our restorative justice work or framework that we lean upon, I often quote Desmond Tutu and his perspective regarding where retributive justice is largely Western. So where if you hurt me, then I want to see someone hurt you. And from our cultures and perspectives, we see justice as restorative, where we believe that when harm is committed, it not only harms the victim, but it also harms the humanity of the perpetrator. And so healing and fixing the perpetrator is also important in uplifting and caring for the victim. Because the reality is we're very focused solely on caring, but we should primarily focus, our first focus should primarily be on the victim of that abuse and that harm. However, if we do not resolve the circumstances and reasoning behind why this perpetrator committed that harm, it will happen. It's a guarantee that it's going to happen again and again, and that practice will be passed on. And so this is the reasoning behind why talking about stepping away from this punitive system is really important. because the reality is it does not apply equally to every community. And because it does not apply equally to every community, communities, particularly communities of color, are often saying that they would rather deal with or approach the internal threats instead of subjecting themselves and individuals to external threats. So that being the systems that we all navigate, have to figure out each and every day. And so we have to address the reality that the threats of this kind of harm is very much, it's amplified in these specific communities. And I don't believe we'll be able to understand or even approach the concept of bringing that collectivist and interconnectedness until we are open and honest about our conversation about how we see the humanity of others.
So I think the thing that I always think about as someone who was born in the United States is that, of course, there is the mythology of the United States, right? But for me, also, there are two Americas, at least. There is an America that has used power and property to do all of the differentiation among race, religion, gender, all of the things that you're naming. And then there is this countervailing movement within American society that we see the abolition movement, and we see the civil rights movement, and we see the queer rights movement, and the women's rights movement, and the labor movement. Susanna, you started by naming all of these movements now around mutual aid and the slow food movement and urban food. And there are all of these, there was utopian societies. And so what I tried to sit with is this tension, this tug of war that I see. Because it's very easy in this moment to just be like, oh, this first piece, power as tool for oppression, tradition within American society, feels very overwhelming right now. It is a crushing force, right? But then we have these moments where I feel that I am in community with people. And I also I have to remember the other collective self of this country, right? So I don't know if you all watched the opening of the Obama Center in Chicago, but I was like, yes. But there is a way that we were trying to be with each other as a country. Yeah. And I think that's the threat that the restorative justice work poses to this other structure, is because if I learn as a child that I am no better or worse than any other young person, regardless of dress or talk, and that we are all accountable for each other, and the society we live in is only as good as the one that we build for and with each other, that is a threat to that first structure, right? Because I have a friend, Kayron Valentine, who says, culture is the curriculum. What is the culture that you are teaching, right? So I sat down with 4 high school students earlier this month. We're honoring one of them in our gathering in the fall. And I said to them, what are the things that you guys have learned serving as peer mediators? And they essentially laid out the elements of emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. I am able to be aware of my emotions, and I'm able to be present and manage my own emotions. I am able to be deeply uncomfortable and remain in the conversation and be comfortable with discomfort. I am willing, even in those moments of discomfort, to be honest and vulnerable. And I develop the resilience to remain in dialogue with people. And so they said that's what we've learned. And what would be different if everyone in the United States learned those things as part of their education? And they were like, oh, well, we could talk about slavery and its impact. We could talk about the genocide of indigenous people. We could talk about structural racism. because all of those things require us to look at difficult truths and be uncomfortable and stay present until we can move through to repair and solution. And so that's why restorative justice work is so threatening.
I think that was such a beautiful presentation of it. And I think the only thing I would add in addition to it is getting comfortable with naming what is that structure. And the reality is that's a white Western structure. To be honest, because exactly what you described with that really great example of the opening of the Obama Presidential Center, that's what Black and brown people, we keep on keeping on all the time. It's a lifelong experience of navigating under these oppressive powers and structures. And it's part of our culture and nature. Having uncomfortable conversations is not new to Black and brown folks, because anytime we talk about an experience we've had, it brings up great discomfort to folks who believe that system is the best and the only way to go. And it's that white Western identity and identity ideology structures, violence, impact that literally everyone around the world, the example I give many times is my family's from Somalia. As a practicing Muslim, my mosque is full of everyone in that room has been touched by American imperialism and violence. The people who are new to and experiencing that for the first time and having to realize that unlike what they've been taught their entire lives, the non-white world has solutions that we're overdue in utilizing in our world. The discomfort and whatnot, it lies with them. We're constantly more experienced and fluent in understanding how different the way we see and navigate the world is to the way that the systems we navigate actually function. And so it's time for the expertise of these communities and cultures to be seen as such, as experts in understanding and navigating it. And practicing discomfort lies more on the hands of the folks who don't understand that or interact with it. But it's a benefit to all of us when everyone does exactly what your student said, when they start practicing being comfortable with the uncomfortable, when they start getting comfortable with talking about the things that we're afraid of talking about or that bring up these extreme feelings and these extreme thoughts. And we're talking about huge challenges that affect us down to our genetic code. That trauma, violence continues to perpetuate through our communities. And so making those next steps and seeing restorative justice as a feasible, real next step for all of us is what folks need to get more comfortable with. And I think part of it is, and a lot of the work that I do, it's ensuring that we're addressing the issue of folks not seeing the non-white world as credible experts.
This is why I invited you guys here. This is getting interesting. I know we've already talked a lot, but this is exactly what restorative justice, I had a sense there's this sort of radical core to it, and it opens up a new system, essentially. And I want to add one thing. I want to name the white Western structure. Environment is part of this. But so I think all of this is this flawed system. And the expertise that you're talking about is what this opportunity in our moment in the country is actually creating a space for this, because people are seeing how unsustainable and how just non-functional this is, the system as we know it.
One of the things that I sit with, Lul, and I'm really taking in everything that you're saying, and I think it's so important, is also that interrogating the binaries that we create as well. Everything that you said about imperialism as it has flowed from Europe and the United States is factually correct. And imperialism has not been limited to the Western world. And oppression is not something that only people who are white do. And so the practice that I think is important is to be able to be in community and hear an expression of, this is the pain I see all around me in my community. And these are all the ways in which Western imperialism has affected people I know and love. And to be able to hear and sit with that and not do whataboutism. And also, there are people in the queer community that are fleeing places in the world, including from Africa and the Middle East, because their lives are in danger because of who they are and who they love. Women are treated different ways in different parts of the world within different structures, right? In a way that is within our communities as well as between our communities. And so I think one of the important things that restorative practice also teaches us is the yes and. So in order for this thing to be true, I don't need to tell you both things are true. Right? And I think that's important for people to be in conversation with each other and say, you have described a reality to me, and I hear you and I see you and I accept everything that you've said, not as a debate or as a correction. And I think that's the thing that happens outside the restorative process, where it's very difficult to be someone who is Jewish and progressive, who expresses criticism of the actions of the Israeli government and expresses solidarity with Palestinian community and the violence that they're experiencing. And it's hard for people to remain in conversation with each other around this. And this yes-anding is a really important skill, because otherwise we're just, my pain is more important than your pain. My history is more important than your history. We're attacking each other to convince each other, which resolves nothing. And to just own that the way that we would own our individual responsibility, have reflection. Then how am I participating? How have I benefited? What am I willing to do to be in community? What is my responsibility to make amends and repair? If we yes and each other, we can get to repair.
Okay, I think it makes sense. And I also think that we don't have to yes and everyone agree. And that's also important to put it out there and have understand and listen and disagree, which is fine. I did want to say both of you in your last remarks, which I'll push back on because somebody said, oh, in your podcast, you can't always agree with everything. I'm like, yeah. So I think both of you very clearly created a dichotomy. And I think we have to remember all of us, every single one of us is conditioned by the United States, by our culture, by our groups, everything. So Elissa, you created a dichotomy right up front, very clear dichotomy. There are two USs. There's the movements and there's the oppressors.
I said, don't do binaries. And then I created a binary.
No. And I think, but that's our brain. It's much easier to have a binary. So you created a binary. So the binary that you created, I was trying to think about pushing back on it, but then we got it off. We got onto the other.
No, this is the work, right?
Yeah, it's
to have the humility to realize that we critique the binary and we advance the binary.
But let me talk about the binary for a minute. This is where I want to bring in a very interesting point, the idea of the tapestry of alternatives, because that concept came from the global South. That is literally what you said about the expertise of Black and Brown people, and not even in the developed world, but actually the global South. That's what that tapestry is. And I think that teaches us something where in this country, it's so easy to be like, there's capitalism. And if I say critique capitalism, they're like, oh, well, that's socialism. No, there's so many things. And in that movement side, if we take the oppressors and the movement has a multiplicity of actors, which is why it's an interesting project. That's one piece. The other thing is right now, what we're doing in this Zoom call is connecting across these communities. So we actually are modeling interconnection. And in that context, I do want to ask both of you just to zoom out and look at this discussion and like, really, what do you want to learn from each other? We have a Jew, a Muslim, a white, a brown person. We have these differences, right? Wait, Lul, you were born in the US though, right?
Yeah, I was born here.
Yeah. So two Americans, but with very different perspectives. What do you feel? And working in the same field, essentially. Agreeing on so much. So where do you see this sort of place that you feel like you still need to kind of bridge to feel like, oh my gosh, I made some progress today, connecting to someone different?
I think from my perspective, I think a lot of what we see as a direct services agency, working with survivors in response to what they've been experiencing, a lot of times what comes to our mind is, how do we prevent this? That's an element of what we do. We're always thinking, how do we prevent this? What if this was put in place? What if that was done? What if they were told this? What if they were shown that? What if they were given this skill or this tool? Would it be able to prevent this? And I think that's why I was really excited to speak with Elissa, because she is at that juncture of where we would like to turn back in time for the folks who are sitting in our office, who are on the phone with us, who are telling us what's going on. We often wish we could go back in time and get in contact with them at the age where Elissa's preparing them and giving them the tools and the skills necessary to, I believe, it's not just a skill of communication and like mediation and conflict resolution, but it's also a skill of defending and protecting the self. We often talk about how so much of this work in terms of interpersonal violence and harm is often a reflection of the work that needs to be done to resolve the relationship between this individual and themselves. And we can only do so much to piecemeal that kind of healing where we want them to see themselves as valuable, as capable, as deserving of better, and as capable of restoring themselves and making it to where they need to. Where we often see that individual, we were hoping we can turn back time and be there when that person really needed intervention and support. And so when I hear and learn of Elissa's work, I'm like, this is giving people power back, giving them control over their, not just their destiny, but giving them the feeling of, hey, I'm more than capable of using this skill to not only identify opportunities for myself, but to also create a positive impact with the people closest to me, with the community around me. And I think particularly across the board when it comes to our youth, we are often stripping them of the things that strengthen them, and we're leaving them in a state of heightened vulnerability. And that harm first begins with harm that occurs to themselves or where they put themselves in harm's way before they begin to be the ones who cause harm to others. And so meeting with Elissa, being able to be part of this conversation, I know we talked very much in the macro, like the larger scale of things, but when we bring it down to the particularities of the work that we do, I'm really happy to and excited to continue to learn about the preventative work that she's doing to keep those people from having to call us, having to get on a hotline and receive those emergency services. What she's doing is a really critical part of that preventative kind of, for the use of that beautiful word, tapestry. It really is another piece that they're able to pull at, utilize, and build upon. And it's really critical because we see adults in crisis. We see their children, that next generation, being affected by that crisis. And so she's doing the work that we wish we could do with the time machine. And so we know that in the coming years, we'll be able to see those numbers go down because hopefully those individuals, adults, will have been given the skills they needed as they move forward to be able to thrive and, more importantly, protect themselves and the community around them. That's my reflective note.
Lul, I think you are doing such extraordinary work that you are coming into situations of physical and sexual violence, and you are welcoming the perpetrator or the abuser into the process of healing. That you are taking this radical stance that is really not radical, that is no human being is disposable. That you are deeply practicing that moral value. And that you are doing so within a community that is experiencing layers and layers and layers of structural oppression and moving with them through that process, giving them what you said, this opportunity of choice, both for the person and for the one who has experienced the physical harm, so that they don't feel like they have to make that choice between perpetuating and demonizing the person who has harmed them and caring for themselves. That process of caring for people on that level is a practice that I wish was embraced more widely. And if government and philanthropy could be our partners in doing this, equally important to reaching people while they're young is not giving up on people when they're not. And that is the work that you are doing. You're saying, we couldn't be there when this young person experienced whatever harm shaped them and led them to make an act of violence against another human being. We are there for both of these people now. We are there for them. We're there for their children. We're there for their families. We are there for the wider community. And we are not walking away from anyone because none of us are disposable. And that is, as a moral grounding and centerpiece, one that I think a lot of us could do well from adopting. And thank you for the example in the work that you do. I wish there was more support for your work than whatever you have already. It should triple and quadruple and expand to support what you're doing.
Thank you so much. That was very kind. I appreciate it. And I wish the same
Yeah.
for you. If the budget's increased.
To lift them up. And thank you, Susanna, for helping to lift up the work that we're doing on the ground and for calling us out on our adoption of binary. I want to own my adoption of that at several points in this conversation and just be so grateful to be in community with people who are like, yes, oh, humbling, did it again. Okay, own it, learn from it, move forward. I think that's the best that we can do is to be in a continuous state of learning rather than defensiveness and to say, oh, okay, I can own that. I did that. I will get to learn how to do better.
Learning and in relationship, which is really powerful. It's really an honor to witness this, to talk with you, to have this conversation. And I think that, it's inspiring. At the end, I usually ask, what keeps each of you going and doing this work?
I think for me, the answer is, I feel like every time I'm asked this question, I think the answer is the same. It's what I would want to see for myself. We know how regularly folks talk about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, 1 in 3 women experiencing sexual assault, 1 in 4 experiencing domestic violence. The reality of all those statistics is just that it's almost a certainty. That's the saddest part, is it's almost certainty that folks will experience a level of violation and harm in their lives. And what motivates me is knowing that we all can play a role in preventing it. We all can. There's no such thing as helplessness or hopelessness when it comes to making a change in people's lives, because it's such a humbling but heartwarming experience when someone tells you how in some way you were able to make a positive impact on their lives. And that's why the world feels so small. It's because we're so close and so connected to one another. And we only lose and we only fail when we forget that, when we feel that we're so disconnected from the challenges that are experienced by people you know, people you don't know. And so for me, what keeps me going is knowing that whatever I do each day, it can have a huge impact, a positive impact on someone else. And so I take it as a call to optimism, to an eternal optimism, because you're only limited by what you believe you're limited by. And so when it comes to protecting people and building stronger communities and stronger individuals and a future that is violence free, you have to take every opportunity with full belief that something good can come from it. And so that keeps me going.
It's hard to add to that. I think that there is this very powerful ripple effect that we each have in the world. There was an early work that I did here in LA after 9/11 when the Jewish community was coming to support our Muslim sisters and brothers who were experiencing racial profiling. And we did text study together. And I think about the commonality in our two traditions between zakat and tzedakah, that these are things that we do not as like it's a nice, if it's a tithe or it's a contribution. This is sort of an essential part of how we move through the world, is being responsible for repair. I think there is teachings in each of our traditions that says the messianic era or something, the prophets are returning to us. What is the first thing that we do when we hear that? And in both of our traditions, the very next thing we do is plant a seed, right? And that's what keeps me going, is that each of our work is planting seeds, and some of those trees will bear fruit in a time where we can see it, but most will not, right? And so I think planting seeds and keep pushing those ripple out into the world and getting those glimpses, right? Lul, you have that experience of if you help a family move through this time of crisis, whether they stay together or they don't, and you see them in community after the experience, right? And for me, it's working with schools and school systems. We recently completed a 7-year partnership with a school district that now has integrated conflict resolution, mediation, and restorative practice into all 10 schools in the district, K through 12. And I met a teacher at another district who said to me, "Oh my God, I grew up in that community. I went to school in that community. I was a teacher in the." I recently went on a site visit back to one of the elementary schools, and I could not believe what I experienced. It was as if the community was completely transformed. And so I see that that kind of thing is possible. And as hard as it is to convince the next district and the next district and the next district to do this work, because it's slow, deep, committed work, that's what keeps me going, is seeing people go, "Oh my God, it actually is possible to make change. It actually is possible. And it doesn't have to go the other way. It can be with this tapestry of alternatives that we built. It actually works. It feels good. It's nurturing. It's beautiful. We want more of it." And when people respond in that way to this work that we do, I think that at its heart is what keeps me going, is this is actually, it's possible. It's possible and it's vital.
Thank you so much. The conversation will continue, but I really appreciate both of you being here.